The hum of the city was a distant, forgotten language. Here, in the heart of the neon-drenched metropolis, high above the relentless pulse of the streets, Elias had carved out his sanctuary. It wasn't a penthouse, not in the traditional sense. It was a forgotten space, a skeletal floor in a skyscraper that had never been completed. The wind whispered through the empty window frames, a lonely symphony that played only for him. He stood before a vast, floor-to-ceiling pane of glass, one of the few that had been installed before the project was abandoned. Below, the city sprawled like a circuit board, intricate and alive with a current he no longer felt a part of. He had once been a vital component of that circuit, a man whose name was synonymous with success, a master of the intricate dance of power and influence. Now, he was a ghost in his own self-imposed exile. It had been 3 years since the betrayal. 3 years since the empire he had built with his bare hands had crumbled, not from an outside force, but from the insidious rot within. His closest confidant, the man he had considered a brother, had orchestrated his downfall with a chilling precision. The world Elias had known, the one filled with adoring crowds and fawning associates, had vanished overnight. He was left with nothing but the hollow echo of their applause and the bitter taste of their treachery. In the immediate aftermath, he had craved connection, a hand to pull him from the abyss. He had reached out, only to find that the hands that had once eagerly shaken his were now closed fists. The solitude that had initially felt like a punishment had slowly, imperceptibly, become his forge. He traced a crack in the glass with his finger, a jagged line that mirrored the fracture in his own life. The city below was a constant reminder of what he had lost, but it was also a testament to what he was building within himself. In this self-imposed isolation, he had discovered a strength he never knew he possessed, a resilience forged in the crucible of loneliness. The silence that had once been deafening was now filled with the clarity of his own thoughts. He had stripped away the non-essential, the superficial layers of his former life, and in doing so had uncovered the unshakable core of his being. He was no longer the man who craved the validation of others. He was a man who had found his own validation in the quiet strength of his solitude. The world outside saw a recluse, a fallen titan licking his wounds. They whispered stories of his madness, of a man broken by his own ambition. They were wrong. He was not broken. He was being reforged. In the silence of his unfinished tower, he was mastering the laws of solitude, transforming himself into something unbreakable. The city could keep its fleeting accolades and its treacherous alliances. He was building an empire within, a fortress of the mind that no one could ever breach. The wind howled a little louder, a primal scream that echoed the untamed power he now felt coursing through his veins. He closed his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. Let them whisper. Let them watch. The ghost of the penthouse was about to show them what it truly meant to be powerful. The first law of solitude that Elias had stumbled upon in his desolate sanctuary was the art of intentional disconnection. It wasn't about simply being alone. It was about consciously severing the tethers to a world that had become a source of constant noise and distraction. In his former life, he had been perpetually connected, a slave to the incessant chime of notifications, the endless stream of emails, and the hollow validation of social media. His mind had been a cluttered attic, filled with the opinions and expectations of others, leaving no room for his own thoughts to breathe. The initial silence of his self-imposed exile had been jarring, a void that his mind desperately tried to fill with a phantom limb of connection. He would find himself reaching for a phone that was no longer there, his fingers twitching with the muscle memory of scrolling through a life that was no longer his. He began by observing the city below, not as a participant, but as a detached observer. He watched the frantic scurry of people, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens, their minds consumed by a digital world that offered the illusion of connection while fostering a profound sense of isolation. He saw himself in their frantic energy, the desperate need to be seen, to be heard, to be validated. It was a game he had played with masterful skill, but a game that had ultimately left him empty and vulnerable. He realized that true connection, the kind that nourishes the soul, could not be found in the fleeting approval of a faceless crowd. It had to be cultivated within. He started small. He would spend hours simply sitting, a discipline that his hyperactive mind initially resisted with a ferocious intensity. His thoughts would race, a chaotic symphony of regrets, anxieties, and what-ifs. He didn't fight them. He simply observed them like clouds passing in the sky. He learned to detach from the emotional charge of his thoughts, to see them for what they were, transient electrical impulses in his brain. This practice of mindfulness, of being present in the moment, was his first step toward reclaiming his mental sovereignty. He was no longer a slave to the whims of his own mind. He was its master. As the days turned into weeks, the chaos within began to subside. In the stillness, he began to hear a voice that had long been drowned out by the noise of the world, his own. It was a quiet voice at first, a whisper of intuition, a gentle nudge of insight. He started to listen to it, to trust it. He began to understand that the answers he had so desperately sought from the outside world had been within him all along. The solitude was not an absence of connection. It was a deeper, more profound connection to himself. He was peeling back the layers of a lifetime of conditioning, of societal expectations, and discovering the authentic self that lay beneath. It was a painful process, a shedding of a skin that had become a part of him, but it was also incredibly liberating. He was no longer defined by his achievements, his possessions, or the opinions of others. He was defined by the quiet strength of his own being. The city below could have its noise. He had found his symphony in the silence. The second law that Elias discovered in his solitary crucible was the deliberate cultivation of a resilient mind. His downfall had been a brutal lesson in the fragility of a mind built on external validation. When the applause stopped, the foundation of his self-worth had crumbled. He had been a puppet whose strings were pulled by the ever-shifting winds of public opinion. In the stark emptiness of his tower, he knew that he had to build a new foundation, one that was impervious to the storms of life. He began to see his mind not as a fixed entity, but as a muscle that could be trained and strengthened through deliberate practice. He started with the stoic practice of negative visualization. Every morning, as the sun painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, he would sit and contemplate the worst-case scenarios. He would vividly imagine losing what little he had left, his desolate sanctuary, his health, his very life. He would allow himself to feel the fear, the grief, the despair that these thoughts evoked. But he wouldn't stop there. He would then meticulously plan how he would respond to each of these imagined calamities. What would he do if he were cast out onto the streets? How would he find the strength to carry on if his body failed him? This wasn't about wallowing in self-pity. It was a form of mental inoculation. By repeatedly exposing himself to his deepest fears in a controlled environment, he was desensitizing himself to their power. He was teaching his mind that he could endure, that he could survive, that he was more resilient than he had ever imagined. He also embraced the concept of amor fati, the love of one's fate. He stopped raging against the injustice of his betrayal. He stopped replaying the past, a torturous loop of what-ifs and if-onlys. Instead, he began to see his downfall not as a tragedy, but as a necessary catalyst for his transformation. He looked at the shattered pieces of his former life and saw not a ruin, but the raw materials for building something far greater, something far more authentic. He began to whisper to himself, "This is what I needed. This is what I chose." It was a radical act of self-empowerment, a reclaiming of his narrative. He was no longer the victim of his circumstances. He was the architect of his destiny. He filled his days with a rigorous routine of reading and learning. He devoured the works of the great Stoic philosophers, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. He saw in their ancient wisdom a timeless guide to navigating the complexities of the human experience. He learned that true freedom lies not in controlling external events, but in mastering our response to them. He learned that the only thing that is truly our own is our mind, and that it is our sacred duty to protect its tranquility. He wasn't just reading these words, he was living them. He was turning his desolate tower into a modern-day Stoa, a school of philosophy where he was both the teacher and the student. The city below was a chaotic sea of emotions, a relentless tide of desires and aversions. He was an island of calm in its midst, a lighthouse of reason in a world of madness. He was building an unbreakable mind, one stoic principle at a time. The third law that emerged from the crucible of Elia's solitude was the rediscovery and mastery of his physical self. In his previous life, his body had been little more than a vehicle to carry his ambitious mind from one boardroom to the next. He had neglected it, fueled it with caffeine and convenience, and treated it as an afterthought. The initial shock of his downfall had taken a physical toll. He had been gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights and the corrosive acid of resentment. But as he began to reclaim his mind, he realized that he could not build a fortress of the mind on a foundation of physical weakness. The mind and body were not separate entities. They were two sides of the same coin, inextricably linked in a delicate dance of existence. His training regimen was as Spartan as his surroundings. He had no state-of-the-art equipment, no personal trainers to bark encouragement. He had only his own body and the unyielding concrete floor of his sanctuary. He started with the basics: push-ups, squats, pull-ups on an exposed steel beam. Each repetition was a small victory, a defiant act against the atrophy that had taken hold of his body and his spirit. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil that still lingered in the recesses of his mind. It was a clean pain, a productive pain, a pain that promised growth and renewal. He learned to embrace the burn, to push past the point of exhaustion, to find a hidden well of strength within him that he never knew existed. He also began to practice a form of moving meditation, a fluid sequence of stretches and poses that he had gleaned from ancient texts. It was a dance of solitude, a conversation between his body and his breath. As he moved through the poses, he felt a sense of grace and power that he had never experienced before. He was no longer a disembodied intellect. He was a fully integrated being, a harmonious union of mind, body, and spirit. The city below was a symphony of jarring noises and chaotic movements. His body was a silent poem, a testament to the beauty of disciplined motion. He extended this discipline to his diet. He no longer craved the rich, decadent foods of his former life. He now saw food as fuel, as medicine, as a sacred offering to the temple of his body. He subsisted on simple, nutrient-dense foods that he procured from the city's underbelly, a world he had never known existed. He learned to cook for himself, to take pleasure in the simple act of nourishing his body. It was another act of self-reliance, another declaration of his independence from a world that had tried to break him. He was sculpting his body as he was sculpting his mind, chipping away at the excess, the weakness, the parts of him that were no longer essential. He was becoming a living embodiment of the unbreakable spirit he was cultivating within. His reflection in the cracked glass was no longer that of a broken man. It was the reflection of a warrior, his body lean and hard, his eyes burning with a newfound intensity. He was a phoenix rising from the ashes, his wings forged in the fire of his own disciplined will. The fourth law that Elias mastered in the silent university of his solitude was the art of creating, not for applause, but for the sake of creation itself. In his previous life, everything he had created had been a means to an end, a business deal to secure more power, a product to generate more wealth, a public image to garner more admiration. His creativity had been a currency, a tool to be wielded in the marketplace of public opinion. When that marketplace had turned against him, his well of creativity had run dry. He had felt a profound sense of emptiness, a void where his ambition had once burned so brightly. In the quiet stillness of his tower, with no one to impress and nothing to gain, he found himself drawn to the simple act of creation. He started with a journal, a blank canvas for his thoughts and emotions. He wrote not for an audience, but for himself. He poured his heart out onto the pages, his fears, his regrets, his hopes, his dreams. It was a raw, unfiltered expression of his inner world, a cathartic release of the demons that had haunted him in the silence. He found that in the act of giving voice to his pain, he was robbing it of its power. He was transforming his suffering into something tangible, something he could understand, and, ultimately, something he could overcome. From writing, he moved to drawing. He had no formal training, no artistic talent that he was aware of. He simply picked up a piece of charcoal from a burnt piece of wood and began to sketch on the concrete walls of his sanctuary. He drew the city below, not as a collection of buildings, but as a living, breathing entity, a complex web of light and shadow, of hope and despair. He drew the faces of the people he had known, not as caricatures of their betrayal, but as flawed, complex human beings, trapped in their own prisons of ambition and fear. He found that in the act of creating, he was also cultivating a sense of empathy, a deeper understanding of the human condition. His greatest creation, however, was a project that was born from the ashes of his former life. He began to design a new kind of business, a new kind of community, one that was built not on the shifting sands of profit and power, but on the solid rock of purpose and connection. It was a vision that had come to him in the depths of his solitude, a whisper of intuition that had grown into a roar of conviction. He spent countless hours sketching out his plans, not on a computer screen, but on large sheets of paper that he had salvaged from the abandoned offices below. He worked with a feverish intensity, driven not by the desire for external validation, but by an inner fire, a deep-seated need to bring his vision to life. He was no longer a destroyer, a ruthless competitor in a zero-sum game. He was a creator, a builder and architect of a better future. He had discovered that the truest form of power was not the power to dominate, but the power to create. The city below was a graveyard of broken dreams and unfulfilled potential. His tower was a womb of creation, a place where new ideas were being born, a testament to the indomitable spirit of human creativity. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was the ghost in the shell, a disembodied consciousness that was about to give birth to a new world. The fifth and final law that Elias learned in his self-imposed exile was the practice of compassionate detachment. His betrayal had left him with a heart full of bitterness and a soul scorched by the flames of resentment. He had replayed the events of his downfall 1,000 times in his mind, each time feeding the fire of his anger. He had fantasized about revenge, about seeing his enemies brought to their knees. But in the clarifying light of his solitude, he began to see the futility of this path. His anger was a poison, and he was the one drinking it. It was a chain that bound him to the very people who had wronged him, a self-inflicted wound that refused to heal. He began to study the teachings of the great spiritual masters, from the Stoics of ancient Rome to the Buddhist monks of the Himalayas. He learned that true strength was not the ability to crush one's enemies, but the ability to rise above them. He learned that forgiveness was not a gift to the person who had wronged you, but a gift to yourself. It was the act of cutting the chains that bound you to the past, of reclaiming your emotional freedom. It was a difficult lesson to learn, a bitter pill to swallow. His ego screamed for vengeance, for retribution. But his higher self, the voice of his newfound wisdom, whispered a different truth. He started by practicing a simple meditation of loving kindness. He would sit in silence and send compassionate thoughts to himself, to the people he loved, and most difficult of all, to the people who had hurt him. He would visualize them not as monsters, but as flawed human beings driven by their own fears and insecurities. He would wish them peace, he would wish them happiness, he would wish them freedom from suffering. It felt unnatural at first, a betrayal of his own pain, but he persisted. And slowly, imperceptibly, he felt a shift within him. The fire of his anger began to cool, replaced by a gentle warmth of compassion. He realized that his enemies had not taken anything from him that was truly his. They had taken his wealth, his status, his reputation. But they could not take his mind, his spirit, his capacity for love and compassion. These were his true treasures, and they were inviolable. He began to see his betrayal not as a personal attack, but as an impersonal event, a part of the grand, chaotic dance of life. He was a single note in a vast, cosmic symphony, and his suffering was a part of the music. This newfound perspective did not make him weak. It made him invincible. He was no longer a victim of circumstance, a puppet of his own emotions. He was a detached observer, a compassionate witness to the unfolding drama of his own life. The city below was a seething cauldron of ambition, jealousy, and revenge. He was a mountain, unmovable, unshakable, his peak in the clouds of a higher consciousness. He had mastered the final law of solitude. He had become unbreakable. The ghost of the penthouse was ready to descend from his tower, not to reclaim his old life, but to create a new one, a life built on the unshakable foundation of his own inner strength. The world had tried to bury him. They didn't know he was a seed, and in the fertile ground of his solitude, he had finally learned to bloom. The time for silence was over. It was time for the world to hear his new song.